In this video, I'm going to provide a very brief introduction expanding on the early history of psychology and early developments that are very, very important, and which I've called the psychological enlightenment. At the start of the psychological enlightenment, we can actually see the psychological enlightenment really starts with thinkers like Kant, which is occurring around the time of the early inception of psychology as a science and a discipline, and making these groundbreaking breakthroughs in the philosophy of psychology. And particularly, it stems from the philosophy of mind and philosophy of mind and body, and that's very, very important that we see this branch of philosophy of psychology, in particular philosophy of science of psychology, emerging from philosophy of mind, and these parallelisms that are foundational to the physiological psychology that Wilhelm Wundt is basing his first psychological experiment on. That's associated with reaction time and responses to that, and that a lot of his work that predates that is focused on these mind-body parallelisms and their association also to the environment. And we can see that reflected in things like stimuli, stimulus, stimulation, and response that he's theorizing about and regarding. And he's very, very important for a school that's emerging here that I'm going to call the psychological enlightenment school, right? They're individuals who are basing their philosophy, their psychology, and their science on Enlightenment principles. And this pertains primarily to psychological processes and physiological processes and embodied processes. Embodied processes that have various processes, expressions, self-expressions, and embodiments that are occurring at multiple levels that involve various mind-body-environment constituents, as well as mind-body-environment constituencies that can be constituted in various ways, or form these constituencies in various ways. And you see a little bit after that, we see a new form of medicine actually emerging. And it's also moving out of this psychophysiological tradition, but it's actually moving a little bit away from the physiological aspect into the psychosocial domain with thinkers like Freud. And Freud, while he started in this psychological enlightenment school primarily with his major contributions he made in terms of his philosophy, particularly with regard to his psychodynamic theory having its early origins in theorizing within inspiration and within attempting to model within psychological processes and regarding perception, but primarily psychological processes. He didn't really get too far in terms of connecting it to perceptual processes. He was more interested in seeing the development of thermodynamics alongside individuals and how they responded to these thermodynamic changes, which was quite actually common amongst the philosophers of that time and era who were theorizing around, particularly when it came to a philosophy of science regarding theories of thermodynamics and particularly entropy. And he was very, very interested in terms of, in his early theorizing, developing a psychological theory alongside a psychological thermodynamic theory, and one that incorporated thermodynamics, and hence you see it within the name psychodynamic theory. However, he actually went astray from a lot of the core theorizing and the applications of psychodynamic theory as what it started off as well as its parallelism to thermodynamics, because as individuals and more considering organisms, and particularly also the self, were operating in relation to stabilizing entropy. So there's a homeostatic basis to that, and you could think of that as keeping our basic motivations, as well as our, particularly for us as individuals with a self and in various forms of embodiment, particularly we try to stabilize ourselves in the world in relation to thermodynamics and adapt to that And it's also associated with our psychological motivations, our unique psychological motivations that are meaning-bound and value-based and have these meaning-laden and value-laden components to them. And they're related to things like autonomy, competence, and relatedness, as well as other aspects of psychological motivation that have more to do with these authentic forms of expression and embodiments associated primarily with that meaning-laden, that value-laden cultivation, as well as thoughtfulness. And our more basic motivations that tend to be universal across all living things, those have very much a core basis. All motivations have a core basis in this, but we can see throughout evolutionary development, and this is where the core reflection between a philosophy that is attempting to separate itself from thermodynamic theory as a physical theory that is pertaining to an indifferent universe that has physical components as well as informational components to them, but that isn't pertaining to these meaning processes that are unique to perceivers within individual organisms that process meaning first, and particularly this empirical meaning, while individuals with a self have more of this perceptual meaning, and that uniquely has this capacity for synthetic meaning, which is very, very important for various behaviors and activities and forms of expressions and processes and perceptions and motivations and emotions and actions and behaviors unique to the human experience. And regarding things like, say, cooking is very synthetic in its nature, right? It has these empirical components as well as perceptual components that we imbue with meaning and value, and we can change its properties and form these synthetic forms of meaning too, alongside our preferences, right? You can think of taste preferences or choice and our sensitivities to those. And when we're thinking about psychodynamic theory, it's very, very important to see that, and you can also see this reflected in Freud's early theorizing, that it has these parallelisms to ideas of thermodynamics, but it's also including aspects of homeostasis, and that's very important because that's largely where there's going to be these divergences between thermodynamic theory as a physical theory that's explaining the natural world and particularly the physical universe, as well as a psychological philosophy of a thermodynamic theory that's predicated within psychological processes and has more to do with adaptation to that, and adaptation to entropy, and things like psychological flexibility as well as adaptive flexibility too. And Freud, I place more in this theoretical camp that you'll see with other thinkers in psychology. So it's more to do with direct psychological theory rather than Enlightenment theory, because he's moving away from that, and he's really pretty much inventing a new form of medicine, which is psychotherapy, which has a lot of pragmatic benefits. So there's a lot of Enlightenment principles there, but more to do with the introduction of therapy in general, and the linguistic aspect of therapy as being beneficial to make verbal or word or lexical associations within the psyche that's very good for restructuring meaning and value and being able to reduce or particularly regulate psychological distress, which contributes to a whole bunch of negative perceptions, negative emotions, negative feelings, negative motivations, negative actions, negative behavior, and a negative self that can be deteriorating and contribute directly to ill well-being, shorten things like the lifespan, contribute to various psychiatric illnesses, psychophysiological conditions, physical conditions, psychological conditions involving diseases, dysfunctions, disorders, even just symptoms of them that dampen well-being and that ultimately produce greater harm. So he was getting people to do things like free association, which is to form these more psychologically flexible pathways, and you see psychological flexibility nowadays, and with tons of research, with the major contributions that Stephen Hayes has made, presenting that and communicating that publicly, and doing scientific research on that, particularly relational frame theory, making these associations through your own psychological processes, and often this is done within a therapeutic context, but you can do it within a journal, or write about it, or just even think about it, is to make these word associations and that are direct to your experience, and form these connections through more of these deliberate processes, and form more of these positive relations that connect meaning and what you find meaningful in particular with your perceptions, motivations, actions, behaviors, and direction in the world, as well as also your values too. So you can think of it, meaning and values, being slightly different, but values more pertaining to this conduct in the world, and how we go about expressing ourselves in various ways, and embodying various psychological, physiological processes that are direct to our perceptions. And the free association allows us to get everything out in the open, but psychological flexibility allows us to form these connections through relational frames, and more of this contextual way of viewing the world. And that's very, very beneficial, and that actually falls more in line within the psychological and Enlightenment school. But the theory that Freud was discussing to a large degree, he ended up moving more towards an informational view of things, and he got away from the physiological basis to a large degree, and he moved away from this idea of embodiment and self-expression, and expression as being direct to perceptions, motivations, emotions, feelings, and actions. And rather, he went inwards and introspectively into these indirect aspects of the psyche to do with the unconscious, which in his early theorizing, there's a lot of this psychological Enlightenment school in it, but in his later theorizing, he goes way too far deep into the lexical and processing the informational aspects of his theory. And you can see that reflected in his ideas of hysteria, which is a linguistic disease. It's a lexical disease. It's verbal. It's a psychosocial disease that's supposed to affect your psyche, and there's very little credibility actually for that in the scientific literature. It's not that it doesn't exist, it's just there's very weak evidence, and oftentimes it can be better explained by other phenomenon, such as moral panic or moral anxiety, civil anxiety, or civil ethical anxiety, if you want to think about it that way, but or even just basic raw psychological distress manifested as complaints or blame or bitter expressions, bitter self-expressions, often in the form of propositions or statements, or whining even, but whining in a particularly distressing way, and that spreads distress. But the Freud himself, he was actually trained as a neurologist and a physician, and he was a medical doctor. And so you see the early origins of psychology focused on these parallelisms between the mind and body, and also it integrates implicitly the environment, because when we're thinking about stimuli and stimulation, that's, it's occurring also within the self, but it's also largely an aspect of the environment, and how we are shaped, and how we also influence reciprocally in these reciprocal relations and associations the environment and ourselves too, and other individuals too. And so that's just a brief overview of these two schools, and I'll be returning to this in the future, and I have some prep work that I'm doing, preparing hopefully to get a video lecture out there, and we'll see about a live lecture on that. So I hope you enjoyed this. Bye.